the 24th of March, 1944, 76 Allied airmen escaped from Stalag Luft 3, a prison camp deep in Nazi Germany. It was the beginning of the most famous escape of the Second World War. 20 years later, Hollywood called it the Great Escape, mixing fact with a generous helping of fiction. The film showed how all but 3 of the men were recaptured, and 50 of them murdered in a flagrant breach of the rules of war. The true story was more tragic still. The airmen mostly met lonely deaths, singly or in pairs, with a bullet in the back. For 3 grim years, the RAF police scoured post-war Germany, tracking down the killers one by one. This is the story beyond the Hollywood legend. The remorseless hunt for the men who murdered the great escapers. The news of the Great Escape murders caused outrage in Britain.
These foul criminals shall be tracked down to the last man.
In June 1944, a furious House of Commons heard Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden vow to find the men responsible.
They will be brought to exemplary justice.
As soon as the war ended, the RAF set up a special unit to investigate the crimes. Leading the team was 38-year-old Frank McKenna, a stern, dry-humoured Lancastrian. He'd spent 17 years in the Blackpool Police.
We're not really sure why Frank McKenna was chosen to lead the inquiry. He certainly couldn't speak German, but he was a very methodical policeman, we know that. He was a religious guy, he was a Catholic. He seems a bit of a loner. He didn't suffer fools gladly, but he was patient.
McKenna had been too old to fight at the start of the war. He'd waited 5 years for age limits to be lifted before joining the RAF. A flight engineer on Lancaster bombers, he survived 30 missions over Germany.
When McKenna actually embarked on this inquiry, he had an affinity with the victims. They were aircrew. He knew them. He felt a strong bond with them.
Before he could solve the murders, McKenna had to understand the escapes. The men had dug a tunnel 25 feet deep and 300 feet long. They'd shifted hundreds of tons of earth, forged hundreds of travel documents, converted their uniforms into civilian clothes, drawn maps and made compasses, and all under the noses of their guards.
We had everything. We had maps, we had diagrams, we had money, we had food. We'd all got various forged papers of some sort. I had papers showing I was a French foreign worker.
Well, it was very difficult to get out because the compound was surrounded with barbed wire, and also about 10 feet inside the wire mesh was another little fence, a couple of feet high. If you stepped over that, one of the guards in each of the 4 corners would shoot.
By 5 a.m. on the morning of the escape, 76 men had emerged from the tunnel and disappeared into the forest surrounding Stalag Luft 3.
Really, you hadn't got a hope. But I think one felt if you could just get outside, if it was only for a day or a couple of days, it was freedom. I was about 20 feet away and I heard a shot fired. And I realized straight away that it had been discovered.
23-year-old Flight Lieutenant Ken Rees was one of the 3 men still in the tunnel when a German guard discovered the exit.
So I shot off backwards because I couldn't turn round, and to the halfway house, which was a part of the tunnel. We had 2 of them, which were slightly bigger than the tunnel itself, so you could turn around in there.
When he emerged from the tunnel, Ken was given the normal punishment for failed escapers.
I was marched to the cooler for a fortnight, was it, or 3 weeks, feeling pretty cold and very fed up that I hadn't kind of got out.
But the airmen who did get out were far less fortunate. In complete disregard of the Geneva Convention protecting prisoners of war, 50 of them would be dead within days. RAF detective Frank McKenna began his investigation into the murder of the Great Escapers, starting with the man the Nazis were most desperate to catch. Squadron leader Roger Bushell was the escape's mastermind. Charismatic and fiercely competitive, he was a fanatical escaper who'd broken out twice before and been caught and tortured by the Gestapo.
I regard him as the bravest man I ever knew. He had been told that if he was ever escaped again, he would never get back alive into a prisoner of war camp. But he was obsessed with the idea of escaping. He was going to have a big escape, and 200 were going to get out, and the Germans were going to be absolutely paralysed and shattered by this whole thing.
21-year-old Flight Lieutenant Alan Bryant never made it into the tunnel. But like all the great escapers, he was well aware of the risks.
I remember Bushell saying a day or two before the Great Escape to a group of us, we can't run an escape like this without one or two of you being killed. And I remember him saying, if you don't want to get shot, bloody well don't go out.
To track down the killers, Frank McKenna had to piece together the chain of events in the days following the escape. He started by tracing the prisoners' escape routes. Zargan was in the middle of Nazi Germany, and the men had scattered to all points of the compass.
You've got 76 men on the loose in Germany, some heading up to the Baltic, some down to Czechoslovakia, some to Switzerland, some to France. The key to success was that they had to cover the greatest possible distance in the shortest possible time, because once the hue and cry spread, once the net widened, they would be nabbed.
The fastest way out was by train, and Zargan railway station was only a mile away from the camp. One of the first to buy a train ticket was 22-year-old Australian pilot James Cattanar.
Jimmy Catternack was a very resourceful fellow. When there was a whole group of us doing various jobs in connection with the tunnel, he would always be one of the leaders, and he was very quick, very alert, very friendly sort of chap. And no one was surprised when he was chosen to be a priority escaper.
Priority escapers were those thought to have the best chance of getting out of Germany. They were the best prepared and the first out of the tunnel. James Cattanar was amongst them because he spoke fluent German. Within hours of the escape, he was heading north with 3 others, a New Zealander and 2 Norwegians. From statements given by surviving prisoners, McKenna learned that Cattanar's group were trying to reach neutral Sweden. But their plan involved enormous risk. It took them right through the heart of a Nazi Germany now on full alert.
Germany will mobilise as many men as possible to hunt them down. Their equivalent of the Home Guard mobilised, soldiers on leave recalled, reservists woken up from their barracks and sent out, thousands of people searching for these 76 desperate men.
The problem for British and Dominion escapers, in particular with their upper middle class backgrounds, didn't make very good social chameleons. They tended to stick out in a whole variety of ways. Not only did they look slightly different from the average European, it was the way they acted. I mean, public school boys don't make particularly good Czech commercial travellers.
Cattanar and the others had darkened their blue Air Force uniforms with boot polish to make them look like civilian clothes. And one of them carried a small fake briefcase made from cardboard. At night, it was a convincing disguise. But in a few hours, it would be daylight. Less than half of the Great Escapers caught trains. The rest had to slog it out on foot. They were known as the hard asses.
It wasn't very attractive country, lots of young pine trees and a lot of snow, and it was very, very cold. So the moment you got out of the tunnel, you started walking, got your compass out, got your direction, and off you walked.
Paul Royal and Edgar Humphreys were the 53rd and 54th men out of the tunnel.
We were heading generally towards Switzerland. That's just a general thing. Southern there. And I think, as far as I remember, Switzerland's down here. About 600 kilometres. I'm not sure what the plan was. Still, we're very optimistic. We thought we'd do it, have a try.
After searching the files for a week, Frank McKenna found something that helped him pinpoint where the men had been murdered. The camp commandant's statement revealed that the bodies of the airmen had been secretly cremated, and the urns containing their ashes sent back to the camp.
When these urns were returned, most of them contained the name of the officer, the place of cremation, and the date of cremation. Now that was an incredible starting point for McKenna. So by actually tracing these crematoriums and going back into the records there, and knowing that the executions had taken place close by, he had a start by looking for the Gestapo that were operating in that area during the war.
Now then, this document here.
A month into his investigation, McKenna flew to Germany with a list of 106 men suspected of involvement in the murders.
Luft 3, Kaltenbrunner, Keitel,
Some were leading Nazis, but most were local Gestapo officers from the places where he knew prisoners had been cremated.
Most of the information that we have is from this chap here, von Lindener.
Key evidence came from prison camp commandant Wilhelm von Lindeiner, who had been outraged at the murder of his prisoners.
He's old school.
Von Lindeiner would later testify that if he had been ordered to shoot the men, he would have shot himself instead.
That's the kind of chap that we are dealing with.
But in 1944, von Lindeiner's opinions had counted for nothing. The orders to kill had come from the very top.
When Hitler heard about the mass escape from Stalag Luft 3, he was absolutely furious. He had had enough of these escapes, which caused a great deal of inconvenience. Thousands of men searching for weeks, wasting time. He decided that they were to be shot outright.
Hitler ordered that all recaptured Great Escapers were to be handed to the Gestapo. Gestapo members swore an oath to obey their Führer on pain of death, and were given wide-ranging powers of arrest, detention, and even execution. Their preferred method, a bullet in the back of the neck, an image that haunted Frank McKenna.
The recurring dream he had was about the format of the execution. He dreamt that the officers were taken out into a field somewhere, marched into the middle of the field, and then at point-blank range,
to locate the men on his wanted list, McKenna had to travel to cities from one end of the country to the other. And post-war Germany was in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied bombs had reduced 70% of German cities to rubble. McKenna had flown over these cities before, in Lancaster bombers, Now he could only wonder how much help the German people would give as he investigated the murders of 50 of the men who had bombed them so remorselessly. Two years earlier, only hours after their escape, James Catenar and his companions were themselves caught up in a bombing raid. The RAF was hitting Berlin again. The German people called the men who flew the planes gangsters and terror flyers. Catenar and his escaped companions were amongst the most hated and most hunted men in Germany. Surviving Great Escapers later saw Catenar's group at Berlin Station. 3 weeks later, their names appeared on a list of the dead, posted on a notice board at Stalag Luft 3. Frank McKenna and his team of investigators set up an office in Germany in January 1946. Their best lead was the ashes of the murdered airmen, ashes they had already traced to crematoria all over the country. But post-war Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Russian.
No, we can't get in here.
At first, the Soviets did not want to help, so McKenna directed his team to investigate murders committed in the West, in cities close to the French border. From the testimony of ex-prisoners, McKenna already knew that escape mastermind Roger Bushell had traveled by train towards Saarbrücken on the morning of the breakout. Bushell had covered more than 400 miles in under 10 hours.
Bushell was certainly a driven man, and like many other top escapers, men such as James Catenar, they were determined to carry on the fight against the Germans. In their own words, they were going to stay operational, and this meant carrying on the war as best they could. I mean, admittedly, they were on the ground, they weren't in the air, but for them, an escape was like another mission. It was a way of carrying the war into enemy territory.
Bushell had been shot down in May 1940 as his fighter squadron covered the retreat at Dunkirk, and he'd been a prisoner of war for more than 4 years.
It must have been incredibly frustrating for a man of his energy and capacities and ambitions to be made a prisoner of war. He had made 2 coherent escape attempts, and each time had come within an ace of reaching Switzerland.
Bushell's last escape attempt had ended horrifically. He'd made it to Prague only to be picked up during a Nazi crackdown.
The Czech family that harboured him was shot. He was taken to the Gestapo headquarters and was beaten and interrogated for months, and could hear the screams of people being tortured. When he came to Stalag Luft 3, he's gaunt and haunted, and he absolutely loathed the Germans and was determined to get revenge.
Bushell's escape companion was Flight Lieutenant Bernard Shadowware, a French national. They were posing as Frenchmen working in Germany and returning home for a break.
Up here.
It was a convincing story. Both men were fluent in French and German.
Sind wir pünktlich?
Ja, wir sind pünktlich.
Their travel papers were hand-drawn forgeries that had taken months to prepare in the camp.
Wohin fahren Sie?
Wir gehen nach Hause.
Less than an hour from the French border, they could afford to be confident. The escapers on trains quickly covered hundreds of miles. But for the hard asses, like Paul Royal and Edgar Humphreys, travelling on foot, progress was slow.
We just walked. It was very, very cold. And looking back on it, I don't know how we ever imagined we could have lasted very long. As soon as day broke, we stopped and we hid. We had plenty of clothes on. We had a bit of food with us, not very much. And next evening, got going again, walked not very far, I suppose, came across a little village. And at about midnight, we were captured by a couple of chaps who probably would be what we would call the Home Guard.
Realising they could be shot as spies, Royal and Humphreys immediately identified themselves as escaped prisoners of war.
For any RAF man on the run in Germany, wearing civilian clothes, there was always the danger that he might be seen as a saboteur or as a secret agent. And so once captured, these RAF men were very keen to make clear that they were servicemen. And once this was ascertained, the Geneva Convention came into force, and then they should have been taken back to their camps, had a rather stiff interview with the camp commandant, and put in the cells for a maximum of 30 days, because escape was a disciplinary punishment, and the maximum punishment for that offence was 30 days solitary confinement.
But Paul Royal and Edgar Humphreys were not returned to Stalag Luft 3. Instead, they were taken to a civilian jail in Görlitz, about 50 kilometers from the camp. Within days, 35 other great escapers were brought to the jail, frostbitten, starving, and in a pitiful condition. The two men were confined together. Then one day, Humphreys was led away at gunpoint.
That was the last time I saw him.
Paul Royal has never understood why he was spared, but his friend killed.
Looking back on it now, when we and the Germans are great mates, it just seems plain stupid. The utter futility of war.
When McKenna was still a police officer in Blackpool, Edgar Humphreys had been stationed at a nearby RAF base. They'd been friends and had drunk together at the officers' mess. But, as McKenna was learning fast, Humphreys was only one death in a landscape of atrocity.
I am the officer commanding the regiment of Royal Artillery guarding this camp. We've buried about 17,000 feet, and we expect to bury about half as much again.
By late 1945, the camps and prisons where these atrocities took place were housing many of the people who'd committed them. Thousands of SS and Gestapo operatives, some of them on McKenna's wanted list.
A lot of them were hiding under different names. So by personally going to these camps, looking at the registers of new people that had been brought in, and asking to interview them and see them, it was only by doing that that he could actually say whether any of these people were involved or not, or whether any of these people were Gestapo from the areas he was actually interested in.
McKenna travelled thousands of miles to interrogate suspects held in camps and prisons all over the country. He made 4 arrests, but progress was slow. And despite their victory, it was still a dangerous place for Allied servicemen. Especially those wearing the uniform of the RAF. A cable stretched across his path was a crude attempt on McKenna's life, and a warning. There were still some in Germany who wanted revenge on the men they called terror flyers. In July 1946, McKenna's team made a breakthrough.
How long have you been a member of the Gestapo?
They tracked down a driver with the Saarbrücken Gestapo.
Who recruited you to be in the Gestapo?
He gave them the clearest information yet on the fate of the escape's chief organizer, RAF hero Roger Bushell. McKenna discovered that Bushell and Shadowware arrived in Saarbrücken about 10 hours after making their escape. The French border was only 20 miles away, and there they hoped to connect with the French underground and obtain a route to freedom.
Steigen Sie hier aus.
Saarbrücken, ja, danke.
But with success in sight, they made a terrible blunder.
Good luck, then, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
By answering in English, Shadowware had made a mistake which would cost them their lives.
I don't think there is any doubt at all that Bushell knew that he was going to be shot. Once he fell into the hands of the Gestapo, he knew his days were numbered.
What day did you...
The Saarbrücken Gestapo driver said that the two men had been shot just outside the city, and their bodies delivered to a local cemetery for cremation.
The urns containing the ashes had come from a crematorium in Saarbrücken. McKenna knew that the Gestapo chief in that area was a guy called Leopold Spann. Spann had been killed shortly before the end of the war. But they also had a name of another Gestapo official from the same area, a guy called Emil Schulz.
Emil Schulz war mein Vater. Ich kenne ihn war ein sehr lieber Vater, der viel gelacht hat. Meine Mutter hatte meinen Vater sehr geliebt, das war Jugendliebe auch von Anfang an. Wir waren eine glückliche Familie. Ich kann mir einmal erinnern, mein Vater war lang Uniformträger. Kriminalpolizei war er zuerst. Nach Schutzpolizei war er Kriminalpolizei. Und einmal kam er heim, er hatte keine Uniform mehr. Und da hat meine Mutter gesagt, das ist nicht gut. Das gefällt mir nicht, Emil. Und ich glaube, dass der Übergang war zu der Gestapo. Weil die Gestapo hatte ja keine Uniform, die war ja privat. Und ich glaube, dass das Verhängnisvolle war.
McKenna raided Emil Schulz's home. Schulz's wife told him she hadn't heard from her husband for many months. But then the RAF men found a recent letter.
My dearest brave darling, it is a wonderful comfort to me that you and the children are safe.
It was unsigned, but written in such intimate language that McKenna was convinced it was from Frau Schulz's husband.
There was no address on the paper, but there was a serial number. McKenna found out that that serial number and that the paper were actually French prison paper, and that the serial number was actually from a prisoner.
Ich bin Emil Schulz.
McKenna was finally face to face with the man who had shot Roger Bushell. But the record of the interview reveals that Schulz had faced a dilemma.
Schulz said yes, he was involved in the murder. He made no denial of that. But basically, he was warned that if he didn't actually take part in it, he would be court-martialed himself and he would face an SS firing squad. And not only that, his family would probably be rounded up and taken off to prison.
Dr. Spann sagte, das war ein Befehl vom Reichssicherheitshauptamt in Berlin. Und konnte es nicht ändern.
Schulz's account was very detailed.
Out!
Orders for the men's execution had come from Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. The prisoners were told they were being driven back to Stalag Luft 3. Then, a short distance from Saarbrücken, they were ordered to stretch their legs and relieve themselves.
Scheidhauer fiel auf sein Gesicht. Buschel krümmte sich.
Schießen Sie! Schießen Sie!
Ich habe zuvor noch nie getötet und habe seitdem keinen mehr getötet. Ich sagte Dr. Spahn, dass es falsch ist, was er macht. Aber er antwortete nur, machen Sie, was ich Ihnen sage. Vergessen Sie nicht, dieser Mann ist ein Terrorflieger. Denken Sie daran, wie unsere Frauen und Kinder in den deutschen Städten gelitten haben. Wenn ich mich geweigert hätte, wäre ich erschossen worden. Was hätte ich machen sollen? Was hätte ich machen sollen?
All the men rounded up by McKenna's team gave the same excuse. The order to kill the prisoners had come directly from Hitler. To disobey was suicide.
Wenn ich überlege, wie mein Vater da stand, praktisch mit der Pistole im Nacken bei ihm, weil es war ja ein Befehl und er hatte zu Hause eine Frau und 2 Kinder. Es ist eine ganz schwere Sache für mich. Von Kind, ich habe auch immer mit Schuld oder Nicht-Schuld oder
Squadron leader Roger Bushell died 5 months short of his 34th birthday. The mastermind of the Great Escape never married and left no family.
Everyone thought 1 or 2 are going to be killed. Yes, you would expect that. That's a part of the game. But, you know, to have 50 murdered. And, of course, they were the key people. They were the best people in the camp. And we were absolutely horrified. Horrified. Because we knew them all. It's terrible. Terrible.
McKenna finally had the man who killed Roger Bushell and was now doubly determined to round up all the others. A year after arriving in Germany, the RAF investigation team had arrested 10 Gestapo officers and charged them with 11 murders committed in 5 separate locations. But the case of Australian flying ace James Cattanar and his group was proving extremely difficult. The urns containing their ashes had been marked with their names, but nothing else.
It wasn't known for certain where these 4 men had been executed and where they'd been cremated.
Christensen had Danish parents.
One of Cattanar's escape partners, Arnold Christensen, spoke Danish.
The other 2 were Norwegians.
Aldur Espelid and Niels Fuglesang were from Norway, so McKenna guessed that they would all try to cross into Denmark and head north towards neutral Sweden.
McKenna decided that there was only one thing to do, and that was basically start checking all the crematoriums north of Hamburg. They came upon the crematorium in Kiel.
Inside, they found evidence that 4 men listed as enemy agents had been cremated in late March 1944. Local Gestapo officers had picked them up from Flensburg, near the Danish border.
The investigators visited the civilian police in Flensburg, and they were able to produce records of the 4 officers being brought into custody. So there was no doubt whatsoever that the authorities knew that these were actually prisoners of war that had escaped from Stalag Luft III and should have been afforded all the safeguards under the Geneva Convention.
The Flensburg police had arrested them when they tried to cross into Denmark. They'd been processed and photographed the same day. Suspicions had been aroused by their dress and the small cardboard briefcase one of them was carrying. The meticulous police records included the names of the Gestapo agents who'd come to collect them. Several of these men were already held in a local detention camp.
The investigators went to the detention camp, where they managed to identify 4 members of the Kiel Gestapo from the list that they had been given.
One was a minor official called Hans Kehler, who had only just joined the Gestapo.
Gestapo chef Fritz Schmidt.
He and 3 colleagues had been ordered by Kiel Gestapo chief Fritz Schmidt to escort the prisoners back to Stalag Luft III. En route, they were to stop and execute them. Kehler testified that he and one of the prisoners arrived in the lead car with an officer named Johannes Post. They were supposed to wait for the others, but Post was impatient. Their prisoner was James Kattenar. Kehler was a desperate man and laid the blame squarely on Post. Post was his superior officer.
This is far enough.
Post chose the location. Post gave the orders. Post pulled the trigger.
Ich habe nicht geschossen. Das war Post.
Johannes Post and Fritz Schmidt were placed at the top of McKenna's most wanted list. Neither man had been seen since the end of the war. But Kehler revealed that Post had kept a mistress in Kiel.
What was her name?
They'd stopped at her apartment on the way to the execution site to drop off some theatre tickets.
Baron! Halt! Marion, halt!
McKenna travelled to Kiel, a city he knew well. It had been the target of his first bombing mission. When he raided Mariana Height's apartment, McKenna found it empty. Neither she nor Post had been seen for months. But McKenna did find a photograph. It was the only image he had of his quarry, and he took it with him everywhere.
By the beginning of 1947, the investigators had travelled thousands of miles throughout occupied Germany. They had found suspects, they had found witnesses, they had brought together evidence. They'd taken something like 100,000 statements from people. Around 50 suspects had been arrested in a dozen cities around Germany. However, the key man that they were looking for, Johann Post, was not amongst them, and the search for him would continue.
McKenna looked for Post and the Kiel Gestapo chief Fritz Schmidt for 2 years, with no success. If they were not found soon, the investigation would end with the murderers of James Kattenar unpunished.
Gotcha.
Of all the men McKenna interviewed, Johannes Post was the most unapologetic and unafraid.
I was in the car with the driver, the prisoner, Kattenak, and criminal secretary, Kehler.
He admitted picking up the Australian airman James Cattanar. They chatted in English as they drove along.
Kayla and I led Katanak to the meadow.
In his interviews, Post admitted he helped choose the place of execution. He and Hans Kayla walked Cattanar a short distance until they were out of sight from the road.
This is far enough.
Post said he ordered Kayla to shoot. But the man was incompetent, so Post took over. He even recalled the last words he and Cattanar had exchanged.
And now I am ordered to shoot you.
Why?
I have killed any number of subhumans. Non-Aryans, vagrants, Jews.
I wish I had had the chance to kill more people like you. These terror flyers I have disposed of were of no more good to the Reich than all the other subhumans whom I have sent on their journey to heaven.
On the 3rd of September 1947, a war crimes tribunal found Johannes Post guilty of murder. Defiant to the end, he was hanged on the 26th of February 1948. Minor official Hans Kayla, who'd not fired his rifle, was also sentenced to death. As he waited for execution, extraordinary efforts were made on his behalf.
October 14th, 1947. Dear Mrs. Cattanar, you'll very wonder to receive this letter, a letter from a German woman, but I ask you with all my heart, after all the unhappiness which came over our countries and all the men through this horrible war, please listen to me and let's speak your motherly heart. My mother is begging for the life of her only one son. It's a plea from a woman to save the life of the man who was convicted of murdering Jimmy. You just can't believe that they could have even written it, but their desperation at saving their brother/son was possibly as heartfelt as the whole Cattanar family on losing Jimmy.
Despite the pleas, the loss of a favoured son was too much to bear for the Cattanar family. The letter went unanswered. The world was still reeling from the full details of the Nazis' crimes. The British authorities were in no mood for mercy. All pleas for Kayla's life were rejected, and he was hanged on the 26th of February, 1948.
Dear Angela, dear Ingeborg, dear Helga, you dears of mine, I am here as a prisoner because I carried out an official order in the spring of 1944. I never on my own initiative acted against the laws of humanity.
Mein Vater hat auch immer wieder geschrieben, ich bin unschuldig. Also er hat jeden Brief geschrieben, ihr müsst mir glauben, ich bin unschuldig. Ich könnte doch euch Kinder nicht belügen, wenn ich solche Schuld auf mich geladen hätte.
Emil Schultz admitted in 3 separate statements that he shot Roger Bushell. His guilt was beyond doubt. But even some of the great escapers themselves have sympathy for his dilemma.
People were ordered by the Germans to do these dastardly deeds. They did claim if they had not done it, they would have been shot themselves. So there's no answer to that. He's probably right. They did act under orders, although they, in their heart of hearts, knew that it was wrong.
On September the 3rd, 1947, at a war crimes tribunal, Emil Schultz was sentenced to death. On the 26th of February, 1948, he was hanged. McKenna's work was done. He'd built cases against dozens of SS and Gestapo members. 13 of them were executed, 17 were imprisoned, and 3 were acquitted. 11 others had killed themselves before they could be tried.
The hunt for the killers didn't stop after 1948. The hunt went on. In 1967, the former leader of the Kiel Gestapo, Heinrich Schmidt, was arrested. He was found and he was taken to court by the German authorities. His lawyers successfully fought his case, and unlike his predecessors who had been hanged for murder, he received just 2 years imprisonment, and in fact didn't even serve the full amount. It seemed the world had changed, things had moved on, times were different.
Frank McKenna went back to being a civilian policeman on the 3rd of February 1948. An intensely private man, he left nothing in writing of his experiences. However, in a rare interview some years after the events, he tried to explain what drove him.
I've talked to lots of ex-prisoners, and without exception, they spoke of it as being their duty to escape. And they did so with typical British reserve and a degree of embarrassment. It seemed to me, and to the chaps working with me, that to be murdered in cold blood for doing one's honourable duty must always be unacceptable to any decent human being. We saw it as being our duty to find the miscreants, and thereafter to bring them before a court of law.